Welcome back to the channel, where we slow down and explore places that don't rush to explain themselves, places that reveal meaning only when you're willing to stay with them. And today that place is Greenland, a land many people think they understand simply because they've seen it on a map, yet very few truly grasp what it feels like to exist here, because Greenland is not a single experience, but a series of worlds spread across ice and ocean, from Nuuk on the southwest coast, where colourful houses cling to rocky hillsides overlooking the sea, to Sisimiut farther north, facing the open Arctic, with fishing boats rocking gently in cold water, to Ilulissat, where massive icebergs drift silently through Disco Bay like slow-moving monuments, and even farther still to Qaanaaq in the high Arctic, where life exists at the edge of human endurance, and polar bears are not symbols but realities. And before anything else, consider this. How does the largest island on Earth, a land larger than many countries combined, remain so sparsely populated, so disconnected, and so indifferent to modern convenience? And what does it mean to live in a place where roads do not connect towns, where you cannot simply drive from Nuuk to Sisimiut or from Ilulissat to any neighbouring settlement? Because in Greenland, roads end at the edge of town, and beyond that point movement belongs to the sea, the sky, the ice and the weather, meaning every journey depends on boats, small aircraft, sleds or patience, and suddenly travel stops being routine and becomes deliberate, sometimes uncertain, sometimes impossible, because a clear morning in Ilulissat can become a grounded afternoon, a calm harbour in Nuuk can turn hostile without warning, and people learn early that schedules here are suggestions rather than promises, and this reality reshapes daily life in subtle but powerful ways, because when movement is uncertain, planning changes, priorities shift, and patience becomes a skill passed down rather than learned, shaping towns that never grow large, not because they can't, but because expansion here carries risk, and even the land itself reinforces this restraint, with fjords carving deeply into the coastline, mountains rising abruptly from the sea, and the interior disappearing beneath an ice-covered plateau so vast it absorbs sound and scale alike, making silence feel heavy rather than peaceful, pressing inward until you become aware of your own breathing, your own movement, your own fragility. And as you move inland near places like Kangerlussuaq, where the ice sheet begins almost suddenly beyond gravel and tundra, you realize that Greenland is shaped less by human design and more by forces that have been working patiently for hundreds of thousands of years, because at the heart of this island lies the Greenland ice sheet, a frozen world layered with time itself, built from snowfall compressed over countless winters, trapping ancient air from climates long gone, preserving storms, dust, and temperatures from eras before human memory, split by crevices that open without warning, revealing deep blue depths that hint at enormous forces below the surface, shaped constantly by winds that never truly rest. And here, curiosity quietly deepens into something more serious, because this ice does not remain still. It moves slowly but relentlessly toward the sea, feeding glaciers like Sermeckujalik near Ilulissat, one of the fastest moving glaciers on Earth, where massive slabs of ice break free and collapse into the water with thunderous force, sending icebergs drifting into Disco Bay and onward into the North Atlantic, influencing ocean currents, ecosystems and coastlines far beyond Greenland's shores, meaning that what happens here does not stay here. and daily life unfolds beneath this awareness, because whether you are in Nuuk waiting for supplies to arrive by ship, in Sisimiut watching weather decide the day's plans, or in East Greenland observing storms roll in from the Arctic Ocean, knowing movement may stop entirely, uncertainty is constant, and adaptability becomes more valuable than technology, shaping how homes are built with bright colors chosen for visibility in snow and darkness, clustered placement for shelter against wind, harbors valued more than highways, snowmobiles treated as necessities rather than tools, and nature never stepping aside, always visible, always present, always in control. And as this rhythm settles in, Greenland begins to feel less like a destination and more like a lesson, one that becomes clearer the longer you listen, because this land does not try to impress you, entertain you, or explain itself. It simply exists on its own terms, quietly asking whether you are willing to slow down enough to understand it. And as you spend more time in Greenland, one place begins to surface again and again in conversations, photographs and memory, because Ilulissat is where many people first truly understand the scale of this land, a small town on the west coast that looks ordinary at first glance, with quiet streets and modest homes, until you reach the edge of Disco Bay and realize you are standing beside one of the most active glacier systems on the planet, where Sermek Kujalik releases enormous icebergs into the water every single day, some as tall as buildings, some stretching longer than city blocks, drifting silently at first before colliding, cracking, and slowly rotating as they move toward the open sea. And the unsettling part isn't their size alone, it's their sound, because when ice calves here, it doesn't shatter like glass, it groans, it booms, it echoes across the bay like distant thunder, reminding you that this frozen landscape is not static. It's constantly in motion, even when it appears calm. And people who visit Ilulissat often expect beauty, but they don't expect weight, because watching these icebergs drift past day after day creates a strange awareness of time, of slowness, of forces that operate on scales far beyond human schedules. And this awareness deepens when you realize that these same icebergs will eventually melt far from Greenland's shores, influencing waters that touch cities thousands of miles away, turning a quiet Arctic town into a silent contributor to global systems most people never think about. And this is where Greenland begins to challenge assumptions, because visitors often arrive expecting emptiness, but instead they encounter intensity, not in crowds or noise, but in presence, in scale, in the feeling that something immense is unfolding just out of reach. And this feeling doesn't stay confined to Ilulissat, because as you move along Greenland's western coast, from places like Aasiat to Qeqertarsuaq on Disco Island, the pattern repeats itself. Small communities positioned carefully between land and sea, built where fishing is possible, where shelter exists, where survival makes sense, and nowhere else. And what becomes clear is that Greenland is not sparsely populated by accident. It is selectively inhabited, shaped by centuries of trial, adaptation, and quiet decision-making, because building in the wrong place here doesn't lead to inconvenience, it leads to failure. And this selective survival carries a psychological effect that visitors often underestimate, because being surrounded by such scale changes how the mind works. Time feels slower, decisions feel heavier, and the usual distractions of modern life lose their urgency, replaced by simple, unavoidable questions like when the next supply ship arrives, whether the weather will hold, and how long the light will last, especially as you approach the darker months, when Greenland begins its gradual descent into winter, and daylight shortens noticeably each day, particularly in towns north of the Arctic Circle, where the sun eventually stops rising altogether, and people in places like Sisimiut and Ilulissat prepare not just practically, but mentally, because polar night is not merely the absence of sunlight, It's a shift in rhythm, mood, and perception. When darkness stretches across weeks, when outdoor movement becomes deliberate rather than casual, and when homes glow warmly against the cold, creating pockets of light in an otherwise shadowed world, and this contrast between light and darkness defines life here as much as temperature does, because when summer arrives, the opposite extreme takes hold, with the midnight sun circling endlessly above the horizon, refusing to set, stretching days into continuous light, altering sleep patterns, blurring mornings and evenings, and quietly reminding people that time in Greenland is governed by the sky rather than the clock. And this cycle of extremes reinforces a deeper understanding that Greenland is not a place you simply visit and observe. It's a place that observes you back, revealing how you respond to isolation, scale, uncertainty, and silence. And this is why many people leave Greenland with a feeling they can't quite describe, a mix of awe and humility. Because the land doesn't offer comfort in the way most destinations do, it offers perspective. And as you begin to grasp that perspective, another layer of Greenland's story starts to emerge, one that stretches back far before modern towns, far before maps, into a history written not in books but in ice, stone, and memory. And as Greenland's deeper history begins to surface, it becomes impossible to understand this land without understanding the people who learned to live here long before modern equipment, supply ships, or weather forecasts existed, because Inuit knowledge is not a footnote in Greenland's story, it is the foundation of survival itself, developed over thousands of years through observation, restraint, and an intimate relationship with the land, sea, and ice. And this knowledge is still visible today in the way people move across frozen terrain, in how they read subtle changes in snow texture, ice color, and wind direction, understanding when ice is strong enough to cross and when it must be avoided entirely, skills that cannot be rushed or learned from books but only through time, patience, and experience passed quietly from one generation to the next, shaping daily life in ways visitors rarely notice at first, because in towns like Sisimiut or smaller settlements along the coast, routines follow the seasons rather than the calendar, with summer bringing fishing, repair, and preparation, while winter demands conservation, planning, and careful use of resources and food. Here tells its own story because traditional diets evolved not by preference, but by availability, relying heavily on fish, seal, whale, and caribou, foods that provide the energy needed to endure extreme cold, darkness, and physical labor. And even today, despite modern grocery stores in larger towns like Nuuk, locally sourced food remains deeply important, both practically and culturally, reinforcing a connection to the environment that most of the modern world has lost. And this connection influences how risk is understood, because in Greenland, risk is not abstract, it is immediate and visible, whether it's thin ice near the shore, shifting weather in the fjords, or wildlife moving through hunting areas. And people here learn early that caution is not fear, it is respect. And this mindset stands in sharp contrast to the confidence-driven culture found elsewhere, because overconfidence in Greenland can be fatal, while humility keeps you alive. And this philosophy extends beyond survival into community life, where cooperation matters more than competition, and where isolation makes relationships essential rather than optional. Because when storms arrive and travel stops, neighbors become lifelines and small communities rely on shared responsibility, shared knowledge, and shared patience. And as you listen to stories from elders, another layer of Greenland's past begins to emerge, one that reminds us that this land has tested not only modern visitors, but entire civilizations, because long before present-day towns existed, Norse settlers arrived here from Iceland and Scandinavia, drawn by relatively milder conditions during a warmer climatic period, establishing farms and communities in southern Greenland near places like Kasiarsuk, where grassy valleys still hint at what once seemed possible, and for centuries these settlers endured, raising livestock, building churches, trading with Europe, believing they had secured a permanent foothold until gradually conditions changed, temperatures dropped, sea ice increased, trade routes weakened, and isolation grew heavier, and one by one these Norse communities disappeared, leaving behind stone ruins that still stand today, weathered but intact, scattered across the landscape as quiet reminders that survival in Greenland has always depended on balance, adaptation, and timing, not determination alone. And unlike the Inuit, who adjusted their practices with changing conditions, the Norse clung to familiar ways of life that no longer fit the environment, and this contrast lingers as one of Greenland's most powerful lessons, because the land itself did not defeat them, inflexibility did, and as you stand near these ruins, surrounded by wind, grass, and distant ice, it becomes clear that Greenland does not punish ambition, it simply ignores it, rewarding only those who listen closely, adjust carefully, and accept limits. And this realization adds weight to every modern decision made here, from where to build, to how to travel, to when to wait, reinforcing the idea that Greenland is not frozen in time, but shaped continuously by those who understand when to move forward and when to stand still. And while much of Greenland's population lives along the western coast, where the sea offers relative access and resources, the eastern side of the island tells a very different story, one defined by remoteness so extreme that even many Greenlanders never travel there, because East Greenland is shaped by towering mountains, heavy sea ice, and weather systems that can isolate communities for weeks at a time. Places like Tasiilaq and Itokortormit, where life unfolds at a slower, quieter pace, and where the surrounding landscape feels larger, darker, and more imposing, because here mountains fall straight into the ocean, fjords remain frozen longer, and storms arriving from the Arctic can shut down movement completely, turning isolation into a physical presence rather than an abstract idea. And in these regions, silence is not occasional, it is constant, broken only by wind, ice, or the distant sound of wildlife. And this silence carries emotional weight because it leaves little room for distraction, forcing people to confront themselves, their thoughts, and their place within a vast, indifferent environment. And yet communities endure, shaped by routines that prioritize awareness, preparedness, and mutual reliance. Because when help is distant, neighbors become essential, and this sense of interdependence deepens respect for the land, because survival here has never been an individual achievement, it has always been communal. And as you move farther north toward areas inhabited seasonally by hunters, the presence of wildlife becomes more pronounced, because Greenland's animals are not confined to parks or reserves, they share the land freely, with whales moving through coastal waters near towns like Sisimiut and Ilulissat, sometimes visible from shore, their massive forms surfacing quietly before disappearing again beneath the water. While farther north, polar bears roam vast territories, particularly along the northeastern coast, where sea ice remains longer and human presence is minimal. And in these regions, polar bears are not tourist attractions. They are apex predators, respected and feared, influencing travel routes, hunting practices, and daily awareness. And this coexistence with wildlife reinforces a constant state of attentiveness, because here Nature does not exist in the background, it exists alongside human life, unpredictable and powerful, and this reality shapes how Greenlanders think about safety, risk, and responsibility, because every journey beyond town limits requires preparation, local knowledge and caution, whether crossing sea ice by sled, navigating fjords by boat, or traveling across tundra during the brief summer months. And this heightened awareness creates a different emotional relationship with the environment, one built on respect rather than control. And as this relationship deepens, Greenland begins to feel less like a place apart from the natural world and more like a place within it, where humans remain participants rather than masters. And this understanding becomes especially clear as you consider how glaciers and ice shape not just the land, but the emotional landscape as well, because glaciers in Greenland are never truly still. They advance slowly, retreat gradually, and occasionally collapse with immense force, sending ice crashing into the sea and echoing across fjords, moments that remind anyone nearby of the power constantly at work beneath the surface. And these sounds, sudden and thunderous, break the stillness in ways that feel both awe-inspiring and unsettling, reinforcing the sense that Greenland is alive, dynamic, and indifferent to human timelines. And as you spend more time here, surrounded by scale, silence, and slow movement, another realization begins to take hold, that Greenland is not just geographically remote, it is emotionally demanding, asking patience, humility, and acceptance from anyone who spends time within its borders. And this demand shapes not only daily life, but how people understand themselves, their limits, and their place in a world far larger than modern routines suggest. And as this emotional weight settles in, another layer of Greenland's reality becomes impossible to ignore, because here, change is not discussed as a theory or debated as a projection. It is witnessed directly, quietly, and repeatedly, especially by those who have lived here long enough to notice the subtle shifts that outsiders often miss, because glaciers that once reached familiar markers now stop short. Sea ice that once formed reliably now arrives later or breaks earlier, and hunters who once followed predictable routes must constantly reassess conditions, not out of fear, but awareness. And in places like Ilulissat, Kangerlussuaq, and along the western coast, scientists work alongside local communities, drilling deep into the ice sheet to extract ice cores that read like frozen timelines, each layer revealing information about temperature, atmosphere, and climate, stretching back tens of thousands of years, turning Greenland into one of the most important natural archives on Earth. And what makes this especially striking is the contrast between the silence of the ice and the urgency of what it reveals, because while the ice appears timeless, its changes are accelerating, and those changes are being measured not only by instruments, but by lived experience, by fishermen adjusting seasons, by elders noticing patterns no longer hold, and by towns adapting infrastructure to conditions that shift slowly but steadily. And this creates a unique emotional tension, because Greenlanders are not alarmists, they are observers, accustomed to change, yet even they speak carefully about how the rhythm of the land feels different now, less predictable, more fragile. And this sense of fragility does not come with panic, but with responsibility, because in Greenland, awareness leads to adjustment, not denial. And this mindset offers a quiet contrast to the noise surrounding climate conversations elsewhere, because here there is no abstraction, only evidence written into ice, shoreline, and memory. And this evidence extends far beyond Greenland itself, because the meltwater flowing from the ice sheet enters oceans that regulate global temperatures, influence currents, and affect weather systems far to the south, meaning that decisions made in distant cities are tied, invisibly but directly, to what happens in this remote landscape. And this interconnectedness adds another layer of gravity to Greenland's story, because it is not merely a place experiencing change, it is a place revealing it, functioning almost like an early warning system for the planet. And yet, despite this role, life continues with the same steady rhythm it always has, because Greenlanders have never had the luxury of assuming stability, and adaptation has always been part of existence here, whether responding to shifting ice, changing wildlife patterns, or evolving technologies. And this resilience does not come from optimism or denial, but from acceptance, the understanding that survival depends on paying attention, staying flexible, and respecting limits. And as this perspective settles in, Greenland begins to feel less like a victim of change and more like a witness, quietly documenting the story of a planet in motion and asking a question that grows heavier the longer you sit with it. If a land this patient, this enduring, is beginning to shift, what does that mean for places that rely on predictability, speed, and permanence? And how prepared are we to respond when the changes Greenland records inevitably reach far beyond its icy shores? And as this long journey through Greenland begins to draw toward its end, what lingers most is not a single place, not Ilulissat's icebergs, not the silence of East Greenland, not even the vast ice sheet itself, but a feeling that's difficult to shake, because Greenland leaves you with perspective rather than answers. And that perspective grows quietly the longer you sit with it, because here survival has never depended on speed, expansion, or certainty, but on restraint, patience, and an understanding of limits, qualities that feel increasingly rare in the modern world. And this is perhaps Greenland's most powerful lesson, because it shows what happens when people build their lives around listening instead of imposing, around adapting instead of insisting, and around cooperation instead of convenience. And this mindset is visible everywhere, from the way towns remain intentionally small, to how people plan days around weather rather than schedules, to how knowledge is shared carefully across generations, knowing that mistakes here carry real consequences. And as you reflect on places like Nuuk, balancing modern life with tradition, or Sisimiut, quietly enduring long winters and brief summers, or the far northern communities near Karnak living at the edge of possibility, it becomes clear that Greenland does not reward excess, it rewards awareness. And this awareness shapes how people understand comfort, success, and progress, because comfort here is knowing when the supply ship arrives. Success is returning safely from a journey, and progress is making choices that allow the next generation to endure. And this way of thinking stands in quiet contrast to a world obsessed with growth, speed, and constant motion, because Greenland reminds us that not everything needs to be faster, bigger, or louder to be meaningful. And as the ice continues its slow movement, as glaciers advance and retreat, as light and darkness trade places each year, Greenland remains steady in its rhythms, even as the planet around it shifts, acting not as a warning, shouted loudly, but as a truth, spoken softly. And perhaps that is why Greenland stays with people long after they leave, because it doesn't try to convince you of anything, it simply shows you what life looks like when nature sets the terms and asks whether modern society still knows how to listen. And as you picture the icebergs drifting silently through Disco Bay, the colourful homes glowing during polar night, the quiet patience of people waiting for weather to decide the day, one final realization begins to settle in, that Greenland does not need to change to matter, it already does, not as a spectacle, not as a destination to conquer, but as a reminder that resilience is quiet, endurance is humble, and survival has always depended on understanding when to move forward and when to stand still. And in a world that rarely slows down, Greenland offers something increasingly rare, a place that exists on its own terms, teaching its lessons patiently, whether we choose to listen or not.